In 1941, America stood on the edge of two worlds, peace and war. The country's factories, once steady with the familiar rhythm of toasters and cars, began to shift. That year, the government awarded over $1.6 billion in defense production contracts, numbers that filtered quietly into the headlines, but signaled something deeper stirring beneath the surface. How do you reshape an entire nation's economy and its soul without anyone quite noticing at first? At Ford's River Rouge plant, for example, workers who had spent years fitting chrome handles onto car doors now found themselves learning the weight and shape of armored plating. The change began with a single contract, a new order on the line, and a different sound echoing through the factory floor, one that hinted at a transformation just beginning to unfold. Inside the factory, a quiet revolution unfolded. The steady routines that had shaped American manufacturing for decades began to shift, often in ways so subtle that only the most attentive workers noticed at first. The soundscape changed. The familiar metallic symphony of Detroit's auto plants, once dominated by the stamping of car frames and the thud of doors, grew uncertain. Machines still worked, but their rhythm was interrupted, as if the entire building was learning a new song. The old patterns, engineers overseeing lines of workers assembling glossy sedans, gave way to something heavier, more deliberate. The sleek symmetry of consumer goods was replaced by the blunt force of military necessity. For years, the auto plants had produced the pulse of a nation on the move. But by 1941, these same spaces were being quietly repurposed. Not overnight, and not with fanfare, but through a series of small adjustments. A new order form here, a revised blueprint there. Workers arrived at their stations to find unfamiliar instructions, sometimes a rough sketch of a shape they couldn't quite place. The polished surfaces they were used to handling were replaced by crude, angular forms. Thick slabs of steel destined for vehicles no one had seen on American streets. Some tried to make sense of it. A door hinge that now had to withstand the impact of shrapnel. A chassis frame that was suddenly twice as heavy. Where once there were sedans and convertibles, there were now the beginnings of armored trucks. No one explained the full scope of what was happening. Instead, the changes crept in, piece by piece. Workers found themselves retrained, sometimes reluctantly, for tasks that felt foreign. Welding soft metal for car interiors gave way to learning how to fuse thick armor plating. The tools changed too. Familiar wrenches and presses were swapped out for specialized equipment that felt awkward in the hand. Engineers, brought in from government agencies or other factories, led crash courses on blueprints for machines most had never seen before. The process was uneven and sometimes frustrating, but it moved forward all the same. For many, the transition was unsettling. Some adapted quickly, finding a new sense of purpose in the work. They joked that the things they were building now could survive anything, even as they struggled with the stubborn new materials and unfamiliar designs. Others felt uneasy. The work, once so closely tied to the rhythms of daily life, helping people get to work, to school, to church, now pointed towards something unknown. They wondered what these machines would be used for, and who would be inside them when they left the factory floor. By mid-1941, the scale of the shift was becoming impossible to ignore. Over $1.5 billion in defense contracts had been awarded to auto manufacturers alone, with billions more flowing into companies that had once made radios, typewriters, or pianos. Ford's Willow Run plant, still under construction, was being prepared to produce a bomber every hour, a goal that seemed almost impossible to the workers tasked with making it real. In California, North American Aviation expanded its facilities, while in the Midwest, factories that had once produced household goods now turned out rifles, aircraft engines, and camouflage netting. The transformation reached into every corner of American manufacturing, from the largest urban plants to the smallest machine shops in rural towns. This reorganization demanded coordination on a scale the country had never seen. The federal government, through agencies like the Office of Production Management, set quotas and deadlines while encouraging businesses to bid on contracts that would stretch their capabilities. Union leaders negotiated new agreements to keep production moving, sometimes clashing with management over hours and wages. The pace was delicate, too fast, and the public might sense a rush toward war. Too slow, and the nation risked being unprepared. Inside the plants, the atmosphere thickened with anticipation. The air was heavy with sweat and the smell of hot metal, but also with something less tangible, a sense of waiting, of being on the edge of something large and unknown. Workers tuned their ears to the new rhythms of production, learning to recognize the sound of armor being shaped, of engines being tested for military use. The days grew longer, the shifts more intense, as the demands of defense work increased. Overtime became common, and the lines between day and night blurred under the harsh lights of the factory floor. The changes didn't stop at the factory gates. Workers carried their new routines home with them, in the stories they told at the end of a shift, and in the questions they couldn't quite answer. Families noticed when a father's hands came home stained with new kinds of grease, or when a mother's schedule shifted to cover an extra shift at the plant. The talk around the dinner table turned to rumors about what was being built and for whom, and to the small adjustments everyone was making to keep up with the new demands. As the months passed, the transformation gathered speed. Training programs expanded, with workers from all backgrounds learning the skills needed for defense production. Women began to appear on the factory floor in greater numbers, filling roles once reserved for men. Retirees returned to work, drawn by the promise of steady wages and a sense of contributing to something larger. The lines between old and new blurred, and the factories became places where tradition and innovation met each day. Some changes were visible. New signs on the factory gates, new badges for workers cleared to handle sensitive materials, new schedules that stretched deep into the night. Others were harder to see, but just as real. The sense of camaraderie deepened as workers realized they were part of something larger than themselves. They shared tips on how to manage the new machines, traded stories about the challenges of retraining, and supported each other through long hours and uncertain times. There were setbacks, too. Machines broke down under the strain of heavier loads, and production targets were sometimes missed. Tempers flared as the pressure mounted, and not everyone adapted at the same pace. But the work continued, driven by a sense of urgency that grew with each passing week. Outside the factory, the rest of the country began to notice the effects of the quiet revolution. Deliveries of consumer goods slowed, and familiar products disappeared from store shelves. Newspapers reported on the growing number of defense contracts, and radio broadcasts carried stories about the new machines rolling off assembly lines. The language of war crept into everyday conversation, even as the country remained officially at peace. The transformation of American industry in 1941 was not a single event, but a process, a series of small decisions and adjustments that, together, changed the course of the nation. Each new contract, each retrained worker, each shift in production marked a step toward a future that was still uncertain. The factories became the engines of that change, humming with a new kind of energy that reached far beyond their walls. As the sun set each evening, the lights inside the plants burned on. Workers finished their shifts and stepped out into streets that felt both familiar and strange, carrying with them the weight of the day's work and the questions that came with it. The sounds of the factory lingered in their ears, a reminder that something important was happening, something that would touch every part of their lives. And in the quiet moments at home, as families gathered around their tables, the echoes of the factory's transformation could be heard in the stories they shared and the silences that stretched between them. The changes inside the plants were beginning to ripple outward, touching homes and routines in ways both small and profound. The revolution in the factory was only the beginning. Its effects were just starting to be felt in the heart of American life. Change, in 1941, reached straight into the American home, threading itself through daily routines and quiet moments. At the center of it all sat the dinner table. The plates were simple, sometimes chipped at the edges, but always carefully laid out. A pale bulb swung overhead, casting a warm, limited glow over the faces of a family gathered close. The father sat at one end, his shirt carrying the faint scent of oil or leather from the factory floor. The mother, hands red and rough from the day's housework, or, some days, from her own shifts outside the home, sat at the other. The children filled the space between, their eyes wide, not quite understanding the subtle tension in the room. The radio in the corner hummed low, then fizzed into static, then silence. On this night, conversation drifted past schoolyard scraps, or where to find sugar at a good price. Something in the air had shifted. For many fathers, the first signs of upheaval arrived with a new work schedule. Shifts stretched and twisted to meet factory demands. The changes weren't just about time. New machines arrived. Quotas grew. Responsibilities shifted. He'd come home quieter, distracted, even as he sat down to his meal. Sometimes he'd mention learning how to weld parts for trucks or assemble something only called equipment. The real changes, though, followed him home. As he silently cut his food, his thoughts wandered back to the plant, where nothing worked quite the way it used to the whispers in the break room that the country wasn't as far from war as it had seemed just months before. For mothers, roles that had once seemed set in stone began to stretch at the seams. Twice now, women she knew, neighbors, cousins, even her own sister, had spoken about jobs opening up at the local factory. Work that paid, if not well, at least steadily. Factories needed more hands, more eyes, more arms that could stand 12 hours on a concrete floor. The foreman had said women could learn the machines just as well as men. The room had gone silent at first, but everyone knew he was right. Not long ago, she'd walked with a friend past the recruiting office and dared to peek through the window. Posters hung there, sent by the government. Women with determined faces, sleeves rolled up, promising that they could do it too. It wasn't an easy decision. The house didn't run itself. Laundry didn't wash itself. Children didn't supervise themselves. The garden she had tended all spring, what the USDA, now called a victory garden, promoted in pamphlets and on the radio, needed weeding, watering, harvesting. In 1941, the government encouraged families to plant these gardens, promising they'd help keep pantries full if war came. She didn't talk much about how war was linked to the vegetables she pulled from the dirt, but she felt it every time she checked the pantry shelves. It was easier to refill the bread basket and let the conversation about factory shifts continue without her. Children, too, felt the stirrings of change, though in ways that sometimes escaped the notice of adults. At school, teachers spoke with new urgency, pointing to distant countries on the classroom map and asking students to pay attention to world events. They were encouraged to write letters to pen pals in Europe, a task they undertook without understanding, but with the sense that it mattered. In the streets, boys who used to play at being cowboys now pretended they were fighter pilots, chasing each other with outstretched arms, the sound of imaginary engines filling the dusk. Their games echoed the headlines and the talk they overheard, even if they didn't fully grasp the reasons behind it. For some families, like the one gathered around this table, the changes crept in gently, like a half-open door letting in a draft. For others, the winds of 1941 rushed in without warning, upending everything. Many families still felt the aftershocks of the Depression. Some had only recently found steady work again. When the chance for regular pay arrived, even if it meant joining the growing defense effort, they couldn't ignore it. Families packed up and moved to follow the work, leaving farms for factory towns, crossing state lines, squeezing into new houses built quickly and close together. With each move came new questions. Would the work last? How would they make ends meet? What would happen if life returned to normal as quickly as it had changed? Normal, whatever that meant, already felt like a memory. Meat grew harder to find. Sugar vanished from shelves faster than shopkeepers could restock. Rationing hadn't been announced yet, but everyone braced for it. Some began storing cans in the basement, just in case. Rumors traveled from house to house. In other places, soap and fuel were already scarce, and young men had stopped waiting for the draft to enlist. It all felt far away, like hearing about a storm that hadn't yet broken over their own town. Women began stepping onto assembly lines in larger numbers, balancing work with the endless tasks waiting at home. In one small-town neighborhood, a mother of 3 named Nadine managed to make it work. Her neighbor watched her younger children while she took the sunrise shift at the plant, sewing parachute canopies. If she got home in time, she'd pin sheets to the line and start dinner before heading to night classes at the county school. There, she learned basic math, not for fun, but because the new machines required careful calculations. The foreman reminded her that every minute saved on errors helped the effort. She didn't ask which effort he meant. Sometimes, it was easier not to know. It wasn't just Nadine. Government messages appeared in newspapers and on handouts, urging families to prepare for sacrifice. Advertisements showed families with glowing smiles pitching in for the greater good. Shortages were framed as a kind of moral duty. For every stitch you save, one slogan read, a soldier gains strength. Sacrifice became an ideal, something exchanged quietly between neighbors. People traded extra buttons, split sacks of hard-to-find flour, admired each other's thrift as much as their generosity. Every little thing, the papers claimed, made a difference. Back at the dinner table, the father pushed his chair back with a sigh. Not quite exhaustion, more the weight of his thoughts. His wife cleared the dishes while the children dashed away to play. They didn't notice the quiet that settled between their parents, but if they had, they might have sensed something that wasn't quite fear, more like caution. Was this a moment that would pass, or the beginning of something that couldn't be stopped? Neither parent said it aloud. Perhaps they worried that speaking it would make it real. In the following weeks, new sounds threaded through the neighborhood. Sewing circles stitched uniforms in basements. Typewriters clacked as mothers wrote letters for sons who hadn't finished learning cursive before the draft. Bicycles rattled against fences as kids raced through town, searching for scrap metal to pile up for the next drive. The soft scoops of dirt in backyard gardens became a familiar rhythm. Each sound was subtle on its own, but together they formed a hum that marked a community in transition. One home, one sacrifice, one unspoken promise at a time. Families adapted. They joked with the neighbors about brown bread and substitute recipes. They clipped newspaper ads on how to make things last and swapped ideas at church socials. Rumors crossed clotheslines. Speculations about future sacrifices and what it might take to get by. No one knew for sure. But in these moments, new rhythms began to form, born not from want, but from a sense of purpose. Evenings brought everyone back to the table, where the edges of conversation sometimes frayed into silence. Most didn't want to admit what nearly everyone sensed. This quiet, growing shift in their lives wasn't temporary. It was the start of something bigger than any of them had planned for. Like the work humming in the local factory, the family's small changes became part of a broader, unseen effort. The patterns of home life shifted, and with them, the routines of the whole town. What started in the factory didn't stay there. It seeped into schedules, habits, and even the ways people measured hope and worry. As summer stretched on, the signs of change grew harder to miss. The local grocer kept a careful eye on his shelves, watching staples disappear faster than before. At church, prayers for peace mixed with whispered updates about relatives who had moved to factory towns or enlisted. The school principal posted new notices about air raid drills and encouraged families to keep their children's medical records up to date, just in case. The postman, who once delivered mostly catalogs and birthday cards, now carried envelopes stamped with government seals and news from distant places. Children noticed too, in their own way. They watched their mothers pull on sturdy shoes before dawn, or listened to their fathers talk quietly with neighbors in the yard after dark. The games they played changed shape. One afternoon, a group of boys gathered in the empty lot behind the hardware store, transforming cardboard boxes into the cockpit of a fighter plane. The youngest, too small to join the others, sat nearby and stitched a scrap of fabric into a tiny armband, copying the adults she'd seen at the sewing circle. Play became a rehearsal for a world that felt both familiar and strange. By late autumn, the garden beds once filled with beans and squash bore the marks of a season's hard work. The USDA's campaign for victory gardens had taken root, and neighbors compared notes on yields and swapped seeds for the next planting. In some homes, jars of homemade preserves lined cellar shelves, a quiet insurance against whatever the winter and the future might bring. The decisions families made, large and small, rippled outward. Some chose to rent out spare rooms to newcomers drawn by factory jobs. Others took in relatives who had lost their own work, crowding more people around the dinner table. A few older children left school early to help support the household, taking jobs as messengers or clerks. Each adjustment felt personal, but together They formed a collective response to a world in flux. Sacrifice became a kind of currency. Neighbors shared what they could, whether it was a cup of sugar, a patch of garden, or a few hours watching someone else's children. Community groups organized drives for scrap metal, rubber, and paper, filling schoolyards with piles of donations. The local newspaper published tips on stretching rations and making do with less, and families clipped the advice, taping it to the inside of cupboard doors. Even the rituals of rest and leisure shifted. Sunday afternoons, once reserved for long drives or picnics, were now spent repairing clothes, writing letters, or tending to the garden. The radio, when it worked, brought news from Washington and London, but also stories of towns like theirs, adapting in ways both big and small. The voices on the airwaves reminded listeners that they were not alone, that their daily efforts were part of something larger. As the year wore on, the sense of waiting deepened. People watched for signs, an extra train passing through, a new face at the general store, a letter from a cousin who had moved east. The familiar rhythms of town life continued, but underneath, something new was taking hold. Evenings grew quieter, conversations more careful. Families wondered what the next months would bring, and whether the changes they'd made would be enough. Still, there was comfort in routine. The dinner table remained a gathering place, a spot where the day's worries could be set aside, if only for a moment. Bread was broken, stories exchanged, and plans made for the next day. The world outside might be shifting, but inside these walls, families held fast to what they could. Yet, as dusk settled over the streets and porch lights flickered on, the outlines of change became clearer. The town's heartbeat, once steady and predictable, now pulsed with a quiet urgency. Neighbors lingered on stoops a little longer, listening for news or the distant sound of a train. Children paused at the edge of their games, watching the grown-ups with new curiosity. The fabric of daily life had stretched, reshaped by forces larger than any one family. In these small moments, around tables, in gardens, on quiet streets, families found ways to meet uncertainty with resolve. Their choices, made day by day, wove together into a larger story, one that reached beyond their own doors and into the life of the town itself. The changes that began in the home did not remain hidden. They moved outward, touching neighbors, businesses, and the quiet routines of the community. As the weeks passed, it became clear that the story of one family was also the story of the town, each echoing the other, each adapting in step. And if you stepped outside after supper, walked down the block, and looked up and down the main street, you might notice it too. The subtle but unmistakable signs that something fundamental was shifting, even if, at first glance, everything seemed just as it had always been. Main Street in 1941 still looked much as it always had, but the rhythm beneath its surface was different now, steady and insistent. The brick facades caught the late sun, casting long shadows across sidewalks worn by decades of footsteps. The hardware store's window reflected a scene that might have belonged to any year. A boy chasing his sister, the tinny echo of a kicked can, the soft jangle of a bicycle bell. The diner's door swung open and shut, letting out a quick gust of warm air and the smell of coffee. Silverware clinked, laughter rose and fell, and the regulars nodded to each other as they slid into their favorite booths. At first glance, the town moved to its familiar pace, but the details told another story. In the general store, the arrangement of goods had shifted. Shelves that once boasted bright tins of peaches and jars of hard candy now displayed more utilitarian fare. Sacks of flour, plain soap, tins of lard. The owner, who had always prided himself on anticipating the needs of his customers, found himself ordering more sewing needles and sturdy thread, the kind used to patch not just shirts, but duffel bags and heavy blankets. He noticed that customers now asked for lantern wicks and work gloves, items that had sat untouched for months before. More of his orders came from new suppliers, names passed along in government pamphlets that arrived quietly in the mail, heavy with hints about what might be ahead. Across the street, the milliner's shop window still displayed a few bright hats, but the bulk of her trade had shifted to practical caps and scarves. She'd stopped ordering elaborate feathers and ribbons, instead keeping a discreet stack of plain head coverings behind the counter for women who were heading to factories or workshops. The shift in her inventory mirrored the town's mood. Less about fashion, more about function. She heard stories from customers about daughters and sisters trying out factory work. And she watched as the lines between what was needed at home and what was needed beyond it began to blur. The diner, always a crossroads for the town's daily life, had changed its hours to match the new shifts at the plant on the edge of town. Early mornings brought in workers just finishing a night's labor, their hands wrapped around chipped mugs, eyes red from lack of sleep. The afternoon crowd was thinner now, replaced by men and women grabbing a quick meal before heading off for the evening shift. The menu changed, too. More filling, simple dishes, less variety. The waitress, who had worked there for years, learned to recognize the new regulars by the set of their shoulders and the tired way they folded their newspapers. She kept her voice gentle, her movements efficient, and she listened to the low conversations about overtime, new machines, and rumors of contracts coming in from out of state. On the sidewalks, people moved with a new sense of purpose. Women walked briskly, arms full of unfamiliar parcels, heavy bolts of fabric, small boxes of tools, or government forms. These were not gifts, nor were they the ordinary purchases of a Saturday morning. Their faces were set, determined, and if you caught their eye, you might see a flicker of worry or pride, depending on the day. Men gathered in small groups near the barber shop or leaned against the hoods of parked trucks, talking in low voices about feed shipments, new quotas, and the possibility of more work. Always more work, just over the horizon. Farmers in particular had started planting extra hay, hedging against rumors that military contracts might soon redirect the usual flow of supplies. The post office, usually a quiet place, had grown busier. Mailbags bulged with official envelopes stamped with government seals, and the bulletin board filled with flyers, some from the War Department, others advertising jobs at new plants, or offering training for unfamiliar trades. People came in to mail applications, to ask about permits, or just to read the notices and see what was changing. The clerks behind the counter grew used to fielding questions they couldn't answer, and the line at the window sometimes stretched out the door on Mondays. Children still played in the street, their laughter bouncing off the storefronts, but even their games reflected the new mood. They built forts out of cardboard boxes, pretended to be factory workers or train conductors, and traded stories they'd overheard at home about new jobs or far-off cities. In the evenings, older kids delivered groceries or ran errands for neighbors, earning a few extra coins for their families. High schoolers, once focused on dances and ball games, now talked about where they might find work after graduation, and whether they'd be called to serve if things overseas grew worse. Neighbors still gathered on front porches at dusk, but their conversations had changed. The talk was less about the weather or the price of eggs, more about who had moved away for work, who had found a job at the new plant, or who was struggling to make ends meet. They shared tips on stretching rationed goods, swapped recipes for substitutes, and quietly helped each other out when someone fell behind. Church groups organized collections for families in need, and the local grocer kept a running tab for regulars he knew would pay when they could. The town's institutions, schools, churches, the library, adapted as well. The principal sent home notices about new rules and encouraged parents to keep their children's records up to date. The librarian set aside books on mechanics and engineering, and Sunday sermons began to reference sacrifice and duty more often than before. Community meetings drew larger crowds, with talk of organizing drives for scrap metal or collecting donations for soldiers' families. Not all the changes were visible. There was a new tension in the air, a sense of waiting. People watched the horizon for signs of what might come next. A new train schedule posted at the station, a letter from a relative who'd moved to a city, a rumor of layoffs or new contracts. The familiar routines continued, but beneath them ran a current of uncertainty. Evenings grew quieter, and people lingered over their meals a little longer, reluctant to let the day end without knowing what tomorrow would bring. The local newspaper reflected these shifts in small ways. Headlines still covered national news, but more space was given to job listings, updates on the factory, and notices about community drives. Editorials urged readers to support local businesses and to prepare for the possibility of shortages. Advertisements encouraged thrift, promoted substitute goods, and reminded everyone that small sacrifices added up to something greater. As the months passed, the town's pulse grew steadier, more focused. Businesses reorganized their shelves, hours shifted to match new routines, and the pace of life adjusted to the demands of a country preparing for something larger than itself. The changes did not arrive all at once, nor did they announce themselves with fanfare. Instead, they slipped quietly into the background, woven into the fabric of daily life. One constant in this season of change was the movement of goods and people. Farmers adjusted their planting. Shopkeepers tracked new suppliers, and workers learned new skills. The town became more connected to the outside world, its fortunes tied to distant factories and government offices. The sound of trains, once a distant part of the landscape, became more familiar as the flow of materials and people increased. The station, usually quiet except for the morning and evening trains, saw more activity. Locals noticed more freight cars rolling through, and the platform filled up a little earlier each day as workers arrived from neighboring towns or headed out in search of new opportunities. The railroad schedule, posted in the window, grew more complicated, with new arrivals and departures marked in pencil. The sense of anticipation grew along with the traffic. People began to measure time by the arrival and departure of trains, by the ebb and flow of workers through the factories, by the shifting stock on store shelves. The regular rhythm of deliveries and departures became part of the town's heartbeat, a steady reminder that change was not just possible, but inevitable. At the same time, the connections between neighbors deepened. People relied on each other more, sharing resources, advice, and encouragement. The boundaries between families blurred as people took in boarders, cared for each other's children, and worked side by side in new jobs. The town's identity shifted, shaped by the collective effort to adapt and endure. Even the landscape changed in subtle ways. Empty lots became garden plots, fences were mended, and new signs appeared in shop windows, advertising jobs or asking for help. The churchyard hosted collection drives, and the school gym filled with donated supplies. Everywhere, there was evidence of a community adjusting to a new reality, making room for what was needed and letting go of what was not. The mood was neither wholly optimistic nor entirely fearful. Instead, it hovered somewhere in between, a quiet determination to make the best of what was at hand, to prepare for what might come, and to hold on to the traditions that gave life its shape. The town's pulse was strong, steady, and adaptable, its people bound together by a sense of common purpose. As evening settled in, the lights in the houses flickered on one by one. The streets quieted, but the sense of movement remained, a kind of collective breath held in anticipation. The hum of the town's new routines blended with the distant sounds of industry and the steady approach of trains on the tracks outside of town. In the stillness, you could almost hear it, the low, persistent rhythm of change, carrying the town forward, one day at a time. And just beyond the edge of town, that sound grew louder, a deep, measured pulse rolling in from the rails. It was the signal of something larger at work, a reminder that the town's story was now part of a much broader movement. The trains kept coming, their engines humming through the night, carrying with them the materials, people, and possibilities that would shape what came next. If you stood beside the tracks in 1941, you'd notice the difference in the air. The rails, always a fixture in the American landscape, now seemed to vibrate with a new kind of energy. The low, rhythmic hum of a freight train rolling over steel rails was more than a background sound. It was a signal, steady, persistent, and impossible to ignore. Across prairies, through mountain passes, and into the hearts of towns both large and small, the railroads had become the connective tissue of a nation shifting into motion. For generations, trains had been the workhorses of American commerce, moving wheat and corn from the heartland to distant cities, hauling coal from Appalachian mines to power plants, and carrying textiles from southern mills to northern factories. Their schedules were as regular as the seasons, their whistles a familiar punctuation in the soundtrack of daily life. But in 1941, the familiar routine was replaced by something sharper, more urgent. The movement of trains became a barometer of change, a visible and audible sign that the country was preparing for a future no one could quite predict. Railroads, once the veins of an expanding nation, now acted as arteries of preparation, channeling vital materials from one end of the country to the other. Steel, coal, aluminum, and crates filled with engine parts made their way along networks that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Gulf Coast to the Canadian border. The priorities shifted swiftly. Freight cars that had once carried fresh fruit or flour now thundered past, packed with iron beams, military vehicles, and the raw ingredients of war. The change was not just in what the trains carried, but in the frequency and volume of their journeys. Rail yards that had once been quiet for hours at a stretch now bustled with near-constant activity. Conductors who had spent decades walking the length of their trains, lanterns swinging in the dusk, found their routines upended. Their trains grew longer, the loads heavier, Instead of livestock or grain, they now watched as military jeeps were chained in place and as sealed crates with cryptic stenciling were loaded at dawn. The markings were new, assigned by federal agencies overseeing the swelling defense effort. Conductors learned not to ask questions. Their job was to keep the trains moving, to ensure every coupling was tight, every brake tested, every shipment accounted for. Sometimes, they'd speculate quietly with the brakemen about the unknown destinations of these mysterious loads. Most of the time, they simply worked in silence, aware that the stakes had changed. It wasn't just the trains or the crews that felt the pressure, the tracks themselves. Many of them, laid down in the previous century, were pushed to their limits. Years of steady use had left them weathered, but nothing had prepared them for the sudden, relentless demands of 1941. Locomotives and rolling stock aged rapidly as the weight of new cargoes pressed down. The infrastructure, never designed for this scale of mobilization, began to strain. In the nation's busiest hubs, places like Chicago, Memphis, and St. Louis, rail yards became choke points. Trains queued for hours, sometimes days, waiting for clearance to move on. Freight piled up on sidings, and the once predictable schedules dissolved into a blur of arrivals and departures. The federal government recognized the growing crisis. In January 1941, the Office of Defense Transportation was established, tasked with the immense job of coordinating the nation's railroads, factories, and military needs. The agency moved quickly, overhauling schedules, redirecting traffic, and issuing new priorities. Passenger trains, once a symbol of leisurely travel and reliable timetables, were frequently set aside to make room for the endless line of freight cars. Delays became commonplace for travelers, but the message was clear. Defense shipments came first. This shift rippled outward, affecting life in every town touched by the rails. In the Midwest, farmers who had grown used to the predictable intervals of passing trains now counted 3, 4, sometimes 5 in a single evening. The grain elevators along the tracks didn't just empty out corn anymore. They loaded crates of raw steel, bound for factories hundreds of miles away. The rail yard in a small town might see a sudden influx of boxcars, their contents destined for new industrial sites rising on the horizon. The trains seemed tireless, their whistles echoing long into the night. In Appalachia, the rhythm of coal mining synchronized with the timetable of departing trains. The mines, some of them family-run for generations, worked double shifts to fill the endless demand. Coal cars rattled down the valleys, moving east to the steel mills of Pittsburgh, where the furnaces burned day and night. The connection was direct and immediate. If the train stopped, the steel would stop, and the factories would fall silent. The Pacific Northwest saw its own transformation. Towering forests, once harvested at a steady pace, now fed a hungry war effort. Lumber was cut, loaded onto flat cars, and sent south to build barracks and airstrips near new military installations. Sawmills ran around the clock, their output entirely dependent on the reliability of the railroads. A missed shipment meant a construction delay. A delay could reverberate all the way up the chain, slowing the assembly of planes or the outfitting of troops. The complexity of this system was staggering. Ore mined from Minnesota's Mesabi Range traveled south to industrial hubs, where it was refined and shaped. Machinery built in Pennsylvania was loaded onto flatbeds, bound for assembly plants in Kansas and Oklahoma. Every link in the chain mattered. A single late shipment could throw off production schedules for days. The network was vast, but its efficiency depended on the smallest details: timing, coordination, and the tireless work of thousands of anonymous hands. Bottlenecks were inevitable. In some places, a shortage of workers left trains sitting idle, their cargo waiting for crews to unload or reroute. In others, too many workers and too few trains meant idle hours and mounting frustration. Rail companies scrambled to respond. They purchased additional cars, pulled old engines out of retirement, and pushed maintenance crews to the limit. Many hub yards saw multi-day delays, with lines of freight cars stretching as far as the eye could see. The government's efforts to coordinate private railway lines into a flexible, cooperative network required constant adjustment and negotiation. Altoona, Pennsylvania, offered a glimpse of the scale and urgency of the task. The Pennsylvania Railroad's Juniata shops, long a center for locomotive repair and construction, operated at a feverish pace. Workers there stripped engines down to their frames, replaced worn parts, and sent every repaired locomotive back to the rails as quickly as possible. There was no time for perfection, only for function and speed. Each engine that left the shop represented another link in the chain, another assurance that the system would keep moving. For the people living along these tracks, the changes were impossible to ignore. The sound of a train whistle, once a familiar comfort, now carried an edge of urgency. It echoed across fields, drifted through open windows, and reminded everyone that their lives were connected to something much larger than themselves. On certain nights, the trains seemed louder, their loads heavier, as if the weight of the country's hopes and fears traveled with them. Rail workers felt the change most acutely. Crews grew accustomed to the size and strangeness of the new shipments: plates of metal too thick for farm work, machinery with no obvious use. They asked few questions, but their curiosity lingered. The work was harder, the hours longer, but there was a sense that what they did mattered in ways it never had before. The rhythm of their days was set by the demands of the rails, the pressure to keep things moving, to avoid delays that might ripple out across the country. As winter gave way to spring, the pace only increased. Schedules tightened, and the glow of oil lamps in the yards became a familiar sight after dark. The trains rolled on, their headlights carving narrow paths through the night, their wheels singing the same relentless song. The physical accomplishment of moving so much, so quickly, was impressive, but it was the persistence, the steady, unbroken rhythm of steel on steel that defined the era. Every town and every worker along the rails was drawn into this momentum. The pulse of the nation was not just in the factories or the offices of government planners. It was here, in the endless movement of goods and people, in the quiet determination of those who kept the trains running. The system was imperfect, full of delays and frustrations, but it held together, held up by the collective effort of thousands whose names would never appear in the headlines. This was the backbone of preparation, the infrastructure that made everything else possible. The transformation of the railroads from civilian carriers to lifelines of mobilization was not a single event, but a process, a series of adjustments, improvisations, and relentless labor. It was a story written in timetables, in the scrape of steel, in the silent resolve of those who worked through the night. As the months passed, the boundaries between the ordinary and the extraordinary blurred. The routines of daily life adapted to the new demands. Storekeepers learned to time their orders to the train schedule. Farmers adjusted their planting to match the flow of fertilizer and feed. Families watched the horizon for the plume of smoke that meant news, goods, or a loved one returning home. The railroads connected them all, knitting together a country that was learning, day by day, how to move as one. The sound of the trains became more than a background hum. It was a signal of change, of effort, of a nation gathering itself for what lay ahead. Every shipment, every repaired engine, every mile of track was part of a larger picture, one that reached into every home and every workplace. The rails carried not just materials, but the hopes and anxieties of a country standing on the edge of transformation. And so, as the trains continued their ceaseless journeys, the story shifted. The focus turned inward to the people who met those trains at the factory gates and in the yards. Their hands would unload the freight. Their skill would transform raw materials into something new, and their determination would shape what came next. The pulse that began on the tracks found its echo on the factory floor, where the true work of mobilization was just beginning. The air is thick, almost sticky, filled with the scent of oil and the faint tang of metal that's been ground, welded, and reshaped more times than you can count. Machines stand in neat rows, humming with a rhythm that feels almost alive, almost steady. But if you look closely, if you stand still and really listen, you'll catch the nervous energy lingering just beneath the surface, an edge to the movements of the men and women at work here. This was no longer just a factory, and for those inside, it was no longer just a job. Something new was taking hold, even if no one could quite put words to it. Take George, standing at his post, his hands no longer moving with the confidence they once had. For 15 years, George had been a machinist, part of an unshakable routine. Monday through Saturday, he shaped crankshafts for cars, each one identical to the one before it. He had the process down to a kind of second nature. His tools felt like extensions of himself, but the crankshafts are gone now. Today, he's machining parts for airplanes, or at least trying to. The metal is unfamiliar, lighter, thinner, but tougher somehow. The blueprint he's following is crowded with details he's not quite used to, and a supervisor, passing behind him, notices the slight pause in his movements as he hesitates before another cut. George adjusts his grip, muttering about getting the hang of it. Though if you asked him later, he'd admit he doubted every inch of that cut. It was a strange time to work. For some, like George, the shift wasn't just a challenge. It was disorienting. Imagine waking up and heading into a factory that looked the same on the outside, only to find the tasks inside slightly off kilter, just unfamiliar enough to remind you that the life you'd known was quietly slipping away. Around the country, workers much like George found themselves training for jobs they hadn't anticipated. Welders painstakingly practiced on thicker steel to match the armor required for tanks. Women poured into factories once dominated by male workers, but now desperate for all the hands they could find. In fact, women like Eleanor, a widow who had never worked outside the home before, went from stitching dresses in her modest kitchen to sewing canvas coverings for military aircraft wings. Her hands ached by the end of her shifts, but she'd tell people it was work worth doing, even if she wasn't entirely sure where those wings might be headed. These stories, multiplied by the thousands, played out every day across the country, in factories both large and small. People often spoke of how America's industrial might was mobilized in the early 1940s, but less frequently about the people who actually powered that change. It was one thing for a government office to draw up production quotas for tanks, airplanes, and ships. It was another thing entirely for the hands of ordinary workers to build them. Yet, by 1941, those hands were everywhere. They tightened bolts and shaped steel. They worked punch presses and lathe machines, sometimes on equipment older than the workers themselves. They stepped into training programs set up to retrain machinists, welders, and paper pushers alike, learning skills they would have never chosen for themselves in more ordinary times. And slowly, imperfectly, they began to deliver. It wasn't easy, though. The shifts were longer, not just by an hour or two, but stretching into weekend work that most people had avoided before. Saturdays became common. Sundays weren't far behind. For families, the adjustment was sharp. Fathers who used to sit down for supper at 6 o'clock now staggered in much later, grease streaked across their overalls, and their spirits too drained for conversation. Mothers who had always been the anchors at home and in the community now balanced double loads, caring for children in the morning as usual, then leaving the house to punch a time card before the afternoon whistle sounded at the assembly plant. Take Mary, for instance. She lived in a small town outside Chicago where the local plant had shifted to building engines for naval vessels. She'd signed up reluctantly after her husband took a job on the overnight shift, and they realized their bills wouldn't wait for the national economy to stabilize. Mary worked afternoons, testing engine pistons for faults, and the factory's break room buzzed with questions from women just like her. What if the war spreads? Someone would ask while unwrapping a sandwich. Will we lose these jobs when it's over? Another voice would counter, what's over even going to look like? You think this is temporary? Those conversations always ended without answers, but they shaped the backdrop of the factory as surely as the punch clock or the hiss of heat-treated metal. And yet, for all the exhaustion, for all the uncertainty and unspoken questions, something else stirred in those factory floors. A certain sense of pride. Small at first, but impossible to miss. This wasn't pride in a paycheck or in finishing a shift without incident. The pride came in watching something unfamiliar, yet undeniably important, take shape in their hands. A wing folded just right, a seam welded tight, a motor that roared to life on its very first go. Workers talked about it in quiet moments, leaning against workbenches or walking to their cars after dark. There was a sense, even then, that they were becoming part of something larger than themselves. Maybe they didn't know the details, but some instincts were hard to ignore. You don't build bombers and tanks unless something's coming. Equally important were the growing unions, which, despite their historical clashes with factory management, became unlikely mediators between labor and the government during this period. Workers in cities like Detroit or Pittsburgh often turned to their unions not just for job protection, but for help navigating the overwhelming changes sweeping through their industries. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, and the American Federation of Labor, AFL, both played vital roles, securing training programs, negotiating for fair wages, and advocating for safety protocols in plants retooled for munitions work. For every major speech delivered in the public eye, there were a dozen quieter negotiations happening behind the scenes. Union leaders asked themselves not how they could just keep up with change, but how they could align the country's surge in production with fair outcomes for those whose sweat and labor made it possible. But even with union support and retraining programs, mistakes still happened. Welds broke, engines stalled, ship hulls warped when poorly aligned panels didn't fit quite right. Each failure brought its own cost, sometimes literally, as shipments were delayed and quotas adjusted downward. Yet these same failures became lessons. By the summer of 1941, factories sped up manufacturing processes to accommodate both increased national demand and the steep learning curve still evident within their labor forces. What truly fueled the transformation, though, wasn't simply a top-down effort issued by government mandates. It was people, millions of them, lifting hammers, operating machinery, scribbling measurements on clipboard paper smudged with oil. People like Jane in California, laying rivets on aircraft fuselages by day and helping her youngest brother with his algebra by night. People like Sam in Michigan, who'd never once considered himself an expert, but agreed nonetheless to train a half-dozen new hires, because the supervisor said they need someone they can trust. And people like George, who finally felt steady again, his hands sure as they machined parts for the P-40 Warhawk, an airplane he would never fly, but would come to view as a sort of monument to everything his factory floor had achieved. As autumn arrived, and the leaves in the northern states began turning red and gold, those workers, those hands, they knew a shift was coming. Words began to weave their way through factory bulletins and break-room chatter. Words like preparedness, like necessary effort, like mobilization. No one spelled it out, but everyone understood it somewhere deep in their bones. What they were building wasn't just machinery. It was security. It was readiness. By the time December arrived, workers in plants across the nation stood by conveyor belts a little more quietly than before, the air carrying a tension that couldn't be named but refused to be dismissed. By then, the machines ran longer than ever. The hum of production filled hours that once belonged to rest. And through that hum, through the grit and exhaustion tangled in those long nights, there rose a quiet determination, unrelenting, unspoken, but steady as steel. We think of America's mobilization for war as a tidal wave, a rush of effort that seemed unstoppable. And perhaps from a distance, it did seem that way. But in places like Cleveland, Tulsa, New York, and everywhere in between, it didn't feel like a tidal wave. It felt like hands on tools, sweat-soaked shirts, and unfinished seams patched back together until they held firm. It wasn't loud or glamorous. It was slow, gradual, and fragile, though no less transformative for it. When the worker stepped up to the line, when Jane laid her first rivets, or George found a rhythm to his machining again, the tide didn't roar all at once. No, it turned gently, steadily pulling the nation forward, one worker, one shift, and one bolt at a time. In the end, the story of 1941 is inseparable from the story of the people who powered it. Their routines changed, their skills were tested, and their lives stretched in ways they hadn't imagined. Each day brought new adjustments, small ones, like learning a new tool, and larger ones, like sharing a meal in the break room with a stranger from another town. They met uncertainty, not with certainty, but with effort, with repetition, and with a sense of purpose that grew day by day into something lasting. It was these workers, men and women, young and old, experienced and new, who, through their steady presence and collective will, quietly shifted the country's direction. They did not know what the next year would bring. But as the final weeks of 1941 slipped by, their hands, their choices, and their perseverance had already begun to reshape the nation's future. Quietly, steadily, and with a resolve that would carry forward into whatever came next. The year was 1941, and across America, daily life shifted in ways both subtle and vast. In factories, rail yards, and on main streets, ordinary people remade routines and learned new skills. By late that year, more than 2 million workers had retrained for defense work. These quiet, determined acts became the groundwork for a global role the nation had never before imagined. Even now, these moments remind us history often grows not from grand gestures, but from steady hands and silent resolve. What did it feel like to shape history with your own hands before any bomb had even fallen? If this quiet revolution moved you, share your thoughts below and subscribe for more peaceful journeys through history.